I think we're going to get started now. I'd like to welcome everyone to this talk. My name is Helen Alexander, and I'm delighted to introduce today's speaker, Chris Helzer. Chris is an expert on prairie ecology, the topic that I think is very critical to conservation here in northeastern Kansas. As I expect many of you know, at least 90% of the land in Douglas County, for example, was once tallgrass prairie, and now we have less than 1%. Chris is the Director of Science and Stewardship for the Nature Conservancy in Nebraska. He conducts research, supervises the Conservancy's Preserve Stewardship Program, and helps develop and test prairie management and restoration strategies. He's also dedicated to raising awareness about the value of prairies through his photography, writing, and presentations. If you don't know about it, I encourage everybody to Google Prairie Ecologist. He has an excellent blog with great essays and superb photos, and some of this is about prairie ecology, some about nuts and bolts of management, but also just the secrets of plant and animal life. He has written 2 books. One is The Ecology and Management of Prairies in the Central United States, and the other is Hidden Prairie, Photographing Life in 1 Square Meter. And the latter is exactly what it sounds like. He's staked out a 1 by 1 meter piece of prairie and then documented with his camera the organisms that are in there. It's just a wonderful book. Both of these are available by the back. The Raven Bookstore has kindly been here, so they'll be selling books, and Chris is willing to sign them as well. Chris's visit is sponsored by 3 groups. One of them is our wonderful Lawrence Public Library, and I want to thank the staff for their help getting this room set up, and also for the refreshments that they kindly brought. I also want to thank the Kansas Biological Survey and Center for Ecological Research, another sponsor. Chris gave a talk there yesterday that was more on prairie management. And if anybody is interested in that talk, you just want to Google the KBS YouTube series, and that'll be available through that. What KBS is a research center that is full of just excellent scientists who work both in terrestrial and aquatic systems. Since I'm a board member, I'm going to share slightly more about the Grassland Heritage Foundation, our 3rd sponsor. We're a nonprofit that manages prairies, provides scholarships for student prairie research, and about monthly we do management work on local prairies. And I greatly encourage anybody to join us. If you've never helped burn a prairie, you're missing out. So there's a table in the back there where you can learn more about GHF and our various opportunities. We also recently began a Sustaining Prairies Fund, and that is to help out schools and other community groups that may have done a prairie planting or restoration of some size. We're open for little to big and need help in maintaining it. And so, again, the table back there has information about that. And to support all these activities, please join us at our spring and fall native plant sale fundraiser. Actually, just seeing Therese made me realize I forgot one thing. This talk will be recorded and available on YouTube as well. So lastly, I just want to thank for those people who have come to our plant sales or otherwise donated to GHF, thank you. And I particularly want to acknowledge the very generous support of Susan Lloyd Marker, who is with us today, who's been particularly helpful. Chris.
Thank you. I haven't said anything yet. All right, we're going to do a light experiment, meaning that we're going to, that's great. That's perfect. Yeah, thank you very much. Okay. Hey, everybody. So I'm Chris. I've been doing prairie things for about 35 years, maybe. I grew up in western Nebraska, went to elementary school in the Panhandle of Nebraska. My family was a family that liked to go fishing and camping. My mom was a bird watcher. We did all those things surrounded by prairie. And yet I went to college not really thinking about prairie at all. And so I keep that in my mind as I talk to lots of different audiences, because I think it's real easy to live close to amazing grassland landscapes and not really focus on them or even realize what they are. And that's going to be a lot of what I talk about today. So I want to start by talking about the fact that I think most people, when they think about prairies, think about these sort of flat, boring places that, why would you go there? What would you do there? Why do they mean anything? Why do people keep talking about it? And prairie is more of a place, like it's a name that we put on developments or buildings or things like that, right? It means the same thing as something like Clear Creek. But prairies are amazing. Prairies are full of life. There's a lot of diversity in prairies. And sometimes they really show off. Sometimes they're really spectacular. Often they're not. You have to look a little bit more closely, but sometimes they do. They're great places to see the sky. When I go to forests, I feel claustrophobic because I can't see the clouds. I can't see if there's a storm coming. I go to the mountains. I have the same issue. I love the mountains, but I like to be on the top of the mountain. The part in between the bottom and the top, I don't like very much because I want to be up on the top so I can see around me. I want to be able to see the sun when it comes up, and I want to see the sun when it goes down. Because even when it's not a spectacular sunrise, it's worth seeing a sunrise. Prairies are also not flat, right? The Flint Hills of Kansas is a great place to show people that prairies are not flat, although even the flat ones are worth something. Historically, bison were a huge part of prairies across the continent. We still have bison in some places. The Nature Conservancy has bison. Ted Turner and all of his ranches have bison. But there are not very many places now where you can see a landscape with bison as a huge component of that prairie landscape, which is too bad in some ways because bison are amazing. They have a lot of cultural impact. They have a lot of ecological impact. The bulls are impressive. The calves are really cute, especially when they fight each other. They're really cute. But I want to make a case really quick for cattle also, which also can be really adorable. And cattle absolutely can do a really nice job of managing landscapes for diverse plant and animal communities. And one of the advantages of cattle is that that's what most of our neighbors, as the Nature Conservancy, use to manage grassland landscapes. And so I spend a lot of my time as a biologist and as a land manager thinking about cattle grazing, but I also think about bison grazing. And I would say that you can do the same kinds of good things with both. You just do it a little bit differently. When we talk about grasslands, one of the easiest ways to get people excited about grasslands is through birds, because there are a lot of people that like birds. Birds are an easy gateway into nature for a lot of people, nature observation. So you can go to grasslands that are relatively short and you can see western meadowlarks. You can go to grasslands that are a little wetter, and typically, especially like hayed prairies or hayed meadows, and you see things like bobolinks, which I like because they look like a blackbird with a lobotomy. They also sing like R2-D2 from Star Wars. What's not to like about bobolinks, right? Dickcissels are something that look a lot like a meadowlark in some ways, but they're sparrow-sized, and they'll be in taller vegetation. So meadowlarks and bobolinks will be in relatively short vegetation. Dickcissels like to be in places where there's a lot of big wildflowers and even shrubs. This one's sitting on a sumac plant. There are birds like scissortail flycatcher, which I have to come to Kansas to see. That like shrubby grasslands. They like grasslands with some scattered trees and shrubs around within the open grassland context. Upland sandpipers are amazing because they're a shorebird. They look like they should be on a beach somewhere, but instead they're perched on fence posts or running around in prairies. And they like large areas of very short grass. And then in Kansas, you guys don't have these anymore. These are sharp-tailed grouse, but you've got two different kinds of prairie chickens. We only have one kind of prairie chicken in Nebraska, where I'm from. But we have a lot of sharp-tailed grouse. And all of these birds are fascinating because most of them don't need trees to nest in, right? They just dump their eggs in a little nest, maybe not even a nest, but they put them on the ground, and they use the needle in a haystack strategy, hoping that they can just put them out in the middle of this large area, and they're going to hide them so that nobody can find them. If you look closely at this picture, you'll notice that not all those eggs are the same, which means that something happened. And what happened in this case, this is a bobolink nest. Remember the bird with a lobotomy. And what happened here was that brown-headed cowbirds found them. So brown-headed cowbird females, which is the one in the front there, the females will sit on a perch like she is right there. They're not always mobbed by males who want to mate with them, but sometimes they are. But when she has time to focus, what she's doing is she's looking around and trying to find a bird like a meadowlark or a grasshopper sparrow or a dickcissel that's coming to and from a nest, and she tracks where that nest is, and then she goes and lays one of her own eggs in that nest when the mom's not there, and then lets the mom of that nest take care of her kids for her which is an amazing strategy. I didn't think about it in time. But it's not great for the host parents often, but it's been happening for 1,000 years, many more than 1,000 years. It is something that can cause stress in some places, but it doesn't make cowbirds bad. Usually where it's causing problems is in a place where the prairies have gotten so small that the haystack is small enough that things like cowbirds can find all those needles that they're looking for. So I say that they nest on the ground, and most of them do. Sometimes they pop their nest up a little bit above the ground. They tie it in between a couple of tall plants. But there are exceptions to that, like burrowing owls, which put their eggs in holes. So burrowing owls are tied often to things like prairie dogs, but they also will use badger holes. So prairie dogs are another example of a species that historically was in a lot of the grasslands that we don't see them in today. And people associate prairie dogs and bison with prairies. That's great, except that because we don't have them a lot today, if people expect to see bison and prairie dogs in every prairie they go to, they're going to be disappointed. We don't want that to be their first experience in prairies. So one of my jobs is to show you that there's lots of other things besides prairie dogs, which is not a knock on prairie dogs. Prairie dogs are really cool and they're really amazing. They're very cute when they eat plants in front of you. But there are lots of other mammals that you can find too, right? You can find jackrabbits or cottontails. Many prairies still have good populations of badgers in them, and badgers dig lots of holes. Here's a quick thing that you may or may not know about badgers, is that when you stumble across a hole that's, almost volleyball sized, that's probably a badger hole. It's a very small chance that there's a badger in the hole. And the reason for that is most of the holes that badgers are digging are hunting holes. So they're running around digging up ground squirrels out of their burrows to eat, and then they leave the hole there, and then when they take off, they're never going to come back to that hole, but lots of other things will use the hole. So box turtles will go down the hole to cool off in the middle of the day. Bumblebees will nest in those holes. They become an architecture of the prairie that's really important for lots of other animals. That badger used it for 10 minutes, and then they'll never use it again. And then there's lots of other small mammals like this deer mouse that are in prairies. They're hard to see. If you do see them, it's usually you just see like the little tail disappearing into the grass as they run through. But you can find them in almost any prairie. There's going to be a mouse of some kind in just about any prairie that you go to. We still have box turtles. There's 2 species of box turtles, I think, in Kansas, right? We just have the ornate box turtle, which is this one, but I think you have eastern box turtles in a lot of Kansas as well. There's lots of lizards in prairies, especially prairies that are drier. Lots and lots of snakes in prairies, and I'm sorry if you don't like snakes. This is my only snake photo. But I like snakes, and this is a beautiful snake. Much of my time as a photographer is spent with insects or other small invertebrates. And part of that is that I like insects, and part of it is my brain just works in a way that I look down instead of up as I walk around a lot. So I'm paying attention to the small things that I see. Just like birds, butterflies are a really nice gateway into insects. So I'm really happy with all the attention that monarchs are getting across the country right now. I'm not happy about the reason that people pay attention to them, but I'm glad that people pay attention to them, because really good monarch habitat is good prairie for lots of other things as well. So if you know anything about monarchs, you know that their larvae feed on milkweed, right? So they need milkweed. There are other butterflies, though, that have similar relationships. So the regal fritillary butterfly is a prairie specialist butterfly that their larvae feed only on violets. So we have to have violets for the regal caterpillars to feed on, just like we have to have milkweed for monarchs. And there's other butterflies that have similar relationships. There's a bunch of little brown fuzzy things called skippers that are a kind of butterfly, and most of them use grasses. Their caterpillars eat grasses. And you might look at this and say, well, that's not a butterfly, that's a moth. What are you talking about? It's a butterfly, and the reason it's a butterfly is if you have to look at the antenna, and if you look at the antenna of a butterfly, at least in this part of the world, it's going to be a long stalk with a little knob at the tip, okay? So you see that, it's just a long antenna, it's a little bit thicker at the tip. And you compare that against something like a moth. Moths, the males of moths have fuzzy antennae, and they use them like little satellite dishes to find females, except that they're picking up chemical signals in the air with those antennae. And then the females don't have to do that, so females tend to have just long, skinny antennae, but there's no little thickened area or little knob at the tip, okay? So this is a moth, not a butterfly, and that's why. So what's this? So this is a moth, because there's not a knob at the tip, but it also looks like a bumblebee, doesn't it? So this is a clear wing moth that is a mimic of a bumblebee, which is probably a smart thing to be if you want to, keep predators away from you. This is also a moth, even though it looks like an airplane. So this is called a plume moth. They do have wings. They can fly. It just doesn't look like it. And then all of moths and butterflies start out as caterpillars. And caterpillars are amazing. They're really fun to watch, but they're also an incredible food source within prairies. They're one of the top food items for most of our grassland birds during the summer months. The second big food item for grassland birds is grasshoppers. And you think about grasshoppers, and I think a lot of people think about these little grass munching machines that sort of just work through prairies and eat everything in front of them. And that's not true for almost all of them. In Nebraska, we have 110 different species of grasshoppers. I don't know what Kansas has, but it's got to be very similar. And there's a real wide variety in the diet of the grasshoppers and in their behavior. There are some that live up in the canopy of grasses. There are some that live on the ground and chop them down like lumberjacks. Many of them don't eat grasses at all. They eat wildflowers, either the leaves or the pollen or both. And they have cousins called katydids, which are similar but different. The biggest easy way to tell them is again with the antenna. So grasshoppers have these short little stubby antenna, and katydids have antennae that are longer than their bodies. So if you see something that looks like a grasshopper but it has long antenna, that's a katydid. Say hi. And then you might have heard about locusts. This is not a locust. Locusts are actually another kind of grasshopper, but many people call cicadas locusts. This is a cicada. There's lots of different kinds of cicadas in the world. They're very noisy, and a lot of them you think about are in the trees around your house, but we have a lot of cicadas out in the prairie that make just as much noise or more. They're really important for lots of other reasons. But prairies also have a lot of insects that are just sort of different looking, like this little plant hopper that you might never see unless you go looking for it specifically or look really closely around you. And there's another plant hopper that I like a lot that is all even harder to see because it basically looks like a leaf with legs. I'll talk about pollinators briefly. I'm going to talk about them more in a minute. Pollinators are fantastic right now because everybody cares about pollinators. And that is tremendous news for those of us doing conservation because just like monarchs, bees are great indicators of good quality prairie. If you have a bunch of bee species, that means that you've got a bunch of flower species. The prairie's doing great, so we like to see bees. They come in all different sizes and shapes and colors. There's hundreds of kinds of bees in Kansas. They all look a little bit different. They're all really pretty. And all of them are descendants of wasps. So give me a second to convince you that wasps are okay, all right? So, there's way more wasps than bees, and they were here first. Bees and ants both came from wasps, all right? So wasps were the OG of the stinging social insects. And even the social stinging insects like paper wasps, they're nectar feeders as adults. So all wasps in Kansas are gonna feed on nectar. They feed on sweet liquid as adults, all right? They feed their kids other things. They go out and catch usually paralyzed insects and feed those to their kids. But as adults, they're feeding on nectar, which means one of the great things about that is if you see a wasp on a flower, it's not defending a territory, it's not defending its nest, it has no reason to be upset about you looking at it. And I'll often just put my hand in front of it as it's crawling on the flower and let it crawl up onto my hand and look at it up close, and then I'll put it back on the flower. Because they're not defensive, they're not gonna sting you unless you threaten them somehow at a flower. I'll give you one example of a wasp that I really enjoy. This is a mud dauber. Mud daubers you probably would recognize if you saw the nest, which looks like a little mud enchilada, and sometimes you'll see them along your house, in your garage, on a fence, different places like that. What happens in here is the wasp goes out and catches spiders, and it stings the spiders and paralyzes them, and then it stuffs them into this little mud enchilada, maybe 6 or 7 spiders, and it lays an egg in there and then seals that up with mud and leaves. So when its egg hatches, the larva feeds on those spiders while they're still alive, by the way. So if you're not a spider fan, you should be a big fan of the mud dauber wasp. You should be a big fan anyway. And so then the larva feeds on those spiders, grows up, pupates, becomes an adult, and continues the cycle again. And many wasps are tiny, tiny, tiny. So if we have, let's say there's 400 or 500 bee species in Kansas, there's probably, 5,000 kinds of wasps in Kansas, I'm guessing. And the reason we miss a lot of them is they're really tiny. But there's lots of other predators, right? Dragonflies, which migrate. You probably know that. A lot of dragonfly species migrate. We're still learning about a lot of different migration patterns. And then there's lots of other predators, things like ambush or assassin bugs here, which caught this little fly. Ants are major predators, but ants have a lot of other things going for them. Again, they're a descendant of wasps. So wasps and bees, I'll talk about bees later, but wasps and bees, many of them are not social. They're individuals, they're solitary. You have a single mom that does all the work for a wasp or a bee family. There's no queen and workers. But there are social wasps, like paper wasps or yellow jackets or hornets. They're the ones that sting us most because they're defending a nest. And they have parts of the community that are there just to defend the nest, right? But if you're a single mom, you can't afford to defend or to go attack somebody, because if you die, the whole nest dies because it depends on you. So you almost never are going to get stung by a solitary wasp or a solitary bee. Anyway, I say all that to mean the solitary or the social wasps are the ones that are defending, they're working in these large groups. Ants are basically social wasps that gave up flight, except during sex, when they still like to have wings, which is fun. But most things about ants that you need to know are that they're incredible predators because they come out, they're very organized, there's lots and lots of them, and so they can attack something large, and they can go find a food source. They'll still steal ants from other colonies to come work for them. They're amazing in a lot of ways. One little thing that I love about ants is that they have a sweet tooth. So in this picture, what you're seeing is ants tending aphids, because aphids, as they feed on plants, are feeding on the liquids in the plants, but there's so much liquid coming into an aphid, it can't process all of it, and you get this sort of sugary liquid bubble that comes out the back end of an aphid called honeydew, which is just a nice way of saying fart bubble, basically. But it's sweet, and ants like to eat that, so they'll hang out where those ants are, and they'll feed on those little fart bubbles of sugar, and then they'll protect the ants from predators like ladybugs or other things. But also because ants have sweet tooths, there are some plants that have figured this out evolutionarily, and they produce extra floral nectar, meaning they produce sweet substances outside the flower to attract ants. And so partridge pea is an example of this. Sunflowers do this. There's other plants that do it. With partridge pea, they make it real obvious. They make a little cup to put the little sweet liquid in, and then ants can come and basically just drink out of that cup. And so you'll see ants running around on partridge pea plants or sunflowers, and they're there just for that little bit of sweet liquid that they can get out of those sunflowers. So I mentioned sunflowers and ants. When you have a lot of ants or any other insect crawling around on a flower, you're going to get predators that are waiting for that to happen, right? So crab spiders are a great example of that. Crab spiders are ambush predators. They don't have a web. They use silk, but not to make webs. And they'll sit on a flower often and wait just for something to come close enough to grab. But there's also spiders that are just sort of moving around the landscape. Again, without webs, they just hunt. So they'll creep up close to something, and then they'll make a final jump and capture it. So lynx spiders, this is a lynx spider. This is a jumping spider. Jumping spiders are the teddy bears of the spider world. So if you want to learn about spiders and you're a little skittish about spiders, start with jumping spiders. They're cute, they're fuzzy, they have great big eyes that are really beautiful. They're not gonna bite you, and you can have them hop from one hand to another if you hold your hands close to each other. And if you move your hand out of the way real quick, it'll fall about 6 inches, and it'll catch itself on a little silk safety line and crawl itself back up on your hand again. They're adorable. They're not like wolf spiders, which are also adorable, but these are the ones that most people are afraid of because these are the ones that if you step on them, they become 1,000 of themselves. That's not what's happening. You just killed the mom and the babies are trying to escape. So I hope you feel good about yourself. But wolf spiders are amazing moms. The wolf spiders carry the eggs around in an egg sac with them, and then they carry the babies around after that. They're a model for all of us, or something. But there are spiders that have webs, right? This is a long-jawed orb weaver. There's a lot of these orb-shaped, these circular webs. There's also funnel webs that I have got one of these that lives in our window every year during the winter. About this time of year, they start showing up and they make a web in the corner of our window, and they catch all the flies that are bouncing around on the window for us. It's really fun to have them in the house if you like spiders. Okay, let's talk about bees just for a second. So I'm going to start by talking about honeybees. I'm going to talk about honeybees so we can get them out of the way and not talk about them anymore, okay? And the reason I say that is honeybees are a European livestock species that Europeans brought to this continent. They're fascinating animals. They have social systems, right? They have queens and workers, and they do a little dance to tell each other where the food is. They're really cool. If you learned about bees in school, you probably learned about honeybees. The problem is when you learned about honeybees, you just learned about them as bees. And so most people think, when they think bees, they really are thinking about honeybees. And like I said earlier, most bees are solitary. There's a single mom doing all the work by herself with a hole in the ground as their nest. Honeybees are sort of an exception to that. And also because they're not from this country and this continent, they're not exceptionally good at pollinating most of our native plants. They're okay, but they're also competing with a lot of those solitary bees that have to, like, it's one mom, she's got to get enough food for her kids, right? We don't need extra competition out here. That's not to say that honeybees are bad. I like eating honey. I appreciate the fact that we have honeybees around, but there's too much attention paid to honeybees and not enough to everybody else, right? Honeybees are not going extinct. And I say that because if somebody has a honeybee hive and they lose the hive, that's hard and it's expensive. They order another one off of the internet and they'll get it delivered to their house and they'll start again. So we're managing them. We're not going to lose honeybees any more than we're going to lose chickens, okay? Again, that doesn't mean there aren't serious issues with honeybees. They're really cool, but I want to broaden your horizons when we think about bees, okay? So let's start with bumblebees. In Nebraska, we have 20 different species of bumblebees. I'm sure it's similar. It's got to be exactly the same or close in Kansas. And then all those little solitary bees that I talked about, there's 400 or so in Nebraska. We don't know because nobody's really done a good job counting them. On the continent, there's between 4,000 and 5,000 species of these bees. Almost all of them are those solitary bees that we've been talking about. So again, they come in all these different shapes and sizes and colors. They match up with different kinds of flowers. They come out at different times a year from each other. They have different nutritional needs for different kinds of pollen and nectar. Most of them live in the ground. They have a little hole in the ground. Often they have a little raised edge on the hole, which is one way you can tell it's a bee or sometimes a wasp versus an ant, for example. And in that little tunnel, a mom will go out and collect pollen and nectar, often mix it together in a little dough ball, bring it back to the nest, go down the tunnel, lay an egg, stick that little dough ball next to it, and seal that up in a little cell. And then she'll go do that again, and she'll stack those cells on top of each other within that tunnel. And then as those eggs hatch, they feed on the food that their mom brought to them until they get big enough, they pupate, they become an adult, and then sometimes that year, sometimes the next year, they'll come out as an adult and kind of continue the cycle. So when the female's not out collecting food, she's often defending the nest against things like wasps or like velvet ants are a kind of wasp. It's a wingless wasp that likes to go down and feed on those little babies. There's all kinds of other things that are after those kids. So the mom's either collecting food or defending the nest, one of the two. It's a tough life. Most bees are pretty generalist in terms of what they eat, and it's really helpful for bees to have a selection of lots of different kinds of flowers because, A, most flowers don't bloom for a full season. So as one flower stops blooming, you have to have others that are blooming to take its place. But also, bees are really good at managing the nutritional needs that they have, especially for their kids. And so they'll pick from the selection available to them, and they'll pick the one that's got the right nutrition for what they're looking for. But there are exceptions to that, and this is one of the exceptions. This is the blue sage bee. It's one of my favorites because it's got a blue eye. It feeds on blue sage or pitcher sage exclusively, as far as we know. This is the only thing that it'll feed on and feed its kids with. So it's got this very tight relationship. One of the things that's really interesting is with climate change, right? One of the things we're seeing is that flowers are starting to bloom at different times. This bee has to come out of the ground. It lives all year underground until pitcher sage starts to bloom, and then it comes up out of the ground and does its work with pitcher sage. It doesn't know when pitcher sage is blooming, so there's got to be this sort of fortunate accident. If the pitcher plant or the pitcher sage blooms at a different time, the bee could get off schedule and we could be in trouble. So far, it seems like everything's working okay, but it's something we're really keeping an eye on with the change in blooming time with climate change. Okay, remember when I talked about brown-headed cowbirds? So this is a cuckoo bee, which is basically the same strategy as the brown-headed cowbird, except with bees. So cuckoo bees will go into the nests of other solitary bees. They'll go down there and lay an egg when the mom's not there and then ditch, and then the mom takes care of their kids for them as they grow up. So you see this in bees, you see it in wasps, you see it in fish. There's a fish species that does this thing. It's a strategy that has evolved separately in lots of these groups of animals because it's a really good idea. So to summarize, bees need lots of kinds of plants, and our wildflowers need lots of kinds of bees. Because if you have lots of bees, the flowers are more sure that they're going to get pollinated. There's a redundancy in that system because there's lots of options available. And I already talked about why bees need lots of flowers, right? To regulate their diet, to make sure there's always consistent food. So if you have lots of flowers and lots of bees, you probably have a really nice, healthy prairie. So I'm really glad that people are excited about pollinators. One last story, and then I'm going to skip into the second half of what I'm talking about here. I want to talk briefly about milkweed. So most people, when they think about milkweed, they think about this, right? Big pink flowered plants, and that's great. A lot of milkweed looks like that. But in Nebraska, we have 17 different kinds of milkweed. Kansas, again, very similar. And not all of them are big and pink. There are little white ones, there's little green ones, there's big green ones, there's big white ones. And they're very important for pollinators. Here's another wasp feeding on nectar off of milkweed. They also have a lot of specialist insects that feed on them. So there's this longhorn milkweed beetle. There are large milkweed bugs, which, by the way, this is a migratory species. So about half or some proportion of these large milkweed bugs every year fly south for the winter, and then the next generation flies north again. And then some of the population stays here, so they hedge their bets, right? If the migrants don't make it back safely, we've got the home population. And if the winter's really bad and the home population dies off, we've got the migrants coming back. It's a really great strategy. But they don't look like something you would expect to do long-distance migration, do they? And then there's lots of other specialist insects that feed on milkweed. And the reason that there have to be specialists is that milkweed has that sticky white latex inside it, right? That tastes bad, that has some toxicity to it. And so not every insect can process that effectively, but there are some that are really good at it. My favorite of those is the caterpillar in the bottom right. Anybody know what that's called? Close, no? Yes, but what's the common name? Yeah, or the unexpected milkweed caterpillar, which is a great name, right? Nobody expects the unexpected milkweed caterpillar. But of course, monarch caterpillars are also, they're best known, right, for feeding on milkweed. But these caterpillars can feed on any species of milkweed that's out there. And that's really important because that provides some redundancy in the system, right? And I want to give you a quick example of why that's important. So in Nebraska, we see our first monarchs in May, almost every year. And the ones that leave Nebraska in the fall fly all the way to Mexico. They overwinter in Mexico. They fly back into the southern U.S., maybe as far as southern Kansas, but like Arkansas, Missouri is where I think of them, Oklahoma. They lay eggs, and then when those eggs hatch, the monarchs that come out of those eggs are the ones that come to Nebraska. So we get the second generation out of Mexico in Nebraska, okay? Except in 2017. And in 2017, we had a bunch of monarchs that looked like this that had clearly come all the way from Mexico straight to Nebraska, and they arrived in April, right? Not in May. And the problem with arriving in Nebraska in April, we don't have a lot happen in the prairies in April in terms of flowers. So they were feeding a lot on dandelions, which is great. Like it did the job. But they were looking desperately to lay eggs on milkweed. And a lot of the common milkweed, the big pink ones, looked like this because we had just had a frost. And it froze off all those milkweed plants, and they all died back, and they were going to have to start growing again. But those monarchs didn't have time to wait around for that. But fortunately, we have 17 milkweed species in Nebraska, and some of them have little skinny leaves that aren't as affected by frosts because they don't have as much surface area. So something like whorled milkweed survives a frost pretty well and ended up carrying the load for that first generation of monarch butterflies in 2017 in Nebraska. So here you see a monarch egg in the bottom left. You see a little tiny caterpillar in the top left. And if you look really closely, you see a little bump on that caterpillar. That's the egg of a parasitoid, which is bad news for the caterpillar, but parasitoids have to make a living too, and they're really important in terms of regulating populations. So not only did whorled milkweed ensure that monarchs survived, they also ensured that parasitoid things like little wasps and flies also survived. So we raised an entire generation on mostly whorled milkweed and made it a really good summer for monarchs at the end of that. But the reason it worked is that we had more than one kind of milkweed. That provides resilience because we got diversity and redundancy mixed in. We can withstand a lot of changes and differences from year to year because we have that resilience built into the system. Okay, I'm going to change gears. I'm going to try out a metaphor I've only tried a couple times, and you have to tell me if it doesn't make sense, okay? It's not even a metaphor, really. Okay. So I think that for many people, arriving at a prairie feels like it feels to me when I show up at a party and I don't know anybody, okay? It feels awkward. You don't know what you're going to do. You don't know who to talk to. You don't know where to go. It feels really uncomfortable for a lot of people to show up at a prairie because it feels like a party you're not invited to or you don't know anybody yet, okay? And in some ways, I think it's even worse than that. It feels like you showed up to a party and you're not even sure there's a party happening, right? Is there even anything here to be here for, okay? So I don't want people to show up at a prairie and feel like that, right? And I also, going back to what we talked about earlier, I don't want them to show up and say, well, this isn't even a prairie, there's no bison, right? There's no prairie dogs at this place. What am I even looking at? So as a way to combat that, I do a lot of talks like I've just done so far, right? Just showing you lots of things that show up in prairies. But Helen mentioned this earlier. In 2018, I came up with an idea to do a different kind of project at a very small scale. So I put 4 flags in the ground in January 2018, and I said, I'm going to spend the rest of this year photographing everything I can within this little square meter of prairie, okay? And it was a lot of fun. I photographed lots of things. It was surprising to me how much fun I had doing it. And it resonated well enough that it turned into a book, which is at the back. It also turned into a museum exhibit in Lincoln with the State Museum in Nebraska. It was a 6-month exhibit where people could go and explore their own little square meter of prairie and look for insects. It was amazing, but it was only 6 months long, and it was during COVID, which is a little bit disappointing. Anyway, the project ended. It was a great way for me to have something to write about in my blog and everything else, and I was just done with it. And 6 years later, Prairie Plains Resource Institute that manages the little prairie that my square meter plot was, they burned off the prairie, and I happened to be out looking shortly after that. And I thought, I wonder if my plot is still there. And I went out and I found the little wires that were left over from the flags, and I thought, I should reflag it, and I'll just stop by and see if anything's happening again. Once or twice during the season, right? So the first time I showed up was about 8 days later. Nice dewy morning. I spent time taking pictures of little things like dewdrops, right? I like dewdrops a lot. So I took lots of pictures of these little dewdrops over and over and over. And then I noticed that there were some little robins hopping around, taking advantage of the bare ground and the moist soil, hunting for robins. And I thought, well, if I back off, I wonder if one of these robins will hop into the plot. That'd be really cool, right? It worked. And I don't think that was exactly the moment, but that was part of the moment that convinced me that I should probably do the project again. So I've spent a lot of my time this year, hanging out here at Lincoln Creek Prairie on the edge of Aurora, Nebraska. Aurora is about a town of 4,300 people. What you can see at the bottom of the picture here is the local dog pound. They call it the Adopt a Pet Center, but it's a dog pound. There's a trailer park to the left of the prairie. There's crop fields to the right. This is not a wilderness area in the way that most people think about wilderness, all right? And the reason I say that is I want you to get the idea that what I see in this little plot, you can see in many, many prairies just about anywhere. So that little circle is where my plot is. If you look from the ground, there it is. It's pointing right past those trees is the local dump. And it's right next to a line of trees. So it's not what most people would even think about prairie being, let alone wilderness. But there's a lot happening. So let me show you some examples. In the plot, there were 21 different kinds of plants that I photographed this year. And they include some big showy things like butterfly milkweed, one of the 17 that we have. There's lead plant that blooms there. There's some pitcher sage. Remember the blue sage bee that was leaning into the plot just enough that I felt like I could count it. My rules are the square meter plot has vertical sides, all right? So anything that's rooted inside counts, even if it's leaning out. And that's important because as I work around this plot during the year, I smash all the vegetation down and things start to lean out. So I have to have that rule. But also, anything that's outside but leans in counts, okay? Final rule, anything that's overhead, that flies straight overhead, counts, but only if I get a good picture of it, because nothing counts if I don't get a good picture of it, okay? There's a lot of things that I saw that I didn't get pictures of that don't count, but everything else counts. Just want to be straight with you on that, okay? And then Maximilian sunflower, which is kind of the star of the show. It's the big showy yellow thing in the middle of the summer. And the species count is important, but what's really more interesting to me is the stories that are happening that I get to watch play out in front of me in this little plot. So I'm going to show you a couple of those stories. With sunflowers in particular, sometimes you show up to a prairie and you see a sunflower that looks like this. And what's happened is there's an insect that has girdled that stem. It's chewed around on that stem so that it tips over, and the flower is not going to survive this. And if you see it where it's still fresh and you look really closely, you can look up in there and sometimes you'll see the culprit. And culprit's the wrong word. It's not doing anything wrong. This is a weevil. It's called a head clipping weevil. And the head clipping weevil girdles that stem and then lays its eggs inside the flower. Because as that flower, here's a better picture of it out of the flower. But as that flower starts to decompose, the larvae of that head clipping weevil feed on that decomposing flower. And you say, well, that's great, but why does it have to kill the flower? Well, the reason it kills the flower is that when a flower looks like this, it's not very attractive to other insects that want to lay their eggs in that flower to eat the seeds. Because this makes it clear there's no seeds going to be in this flower, so there's no reason for you to compete with my babies that I've just put in this flower, right? And then eventually this falls off, hits the ground, and the larvae crawl down into the soil and overwinter there in the soil, and then come up and do it again next year. By the way, every picture you see from those aerial photos that I showed, everything from here on until I stop talking, all the pictures are within that square meter plot, just to be clear, okay? So all of this happened within that plot. One of the flowers I haven't talked about is called black nightshade. Black nightshade's an annual plant. Seed in the spring, grows, flowers, produces seeds, dies. So this is what it looks like in the flower. Here's what it looks like with some leaves on it. I showed up one day in the plot, and I wasn't alone, which is common. But this time there was a gang that had showed up, and it was a gang of these little beetles. They were about an inch long. I'd never seen anything like it. I didn't know what it was. It looked like, I thought I knew what it was. I knew it was a beetle. I knew it was probably a blister beetle of some kind, and it was. But what happened was that gang of blister beetles that showed up basically completely defoliated 2 plants of black nightshade within a few hours. And they just ravaged these plants. I walked around the prairie, the rest of the prairie, and I checked all the other black nightshade plants. And not only did I not see the beetles, but I didn't see any evidence that the beetles had been there. And I still haven't, since between now and then, I haven't seen that. I don't know why they picked my little plot to do this in. But they ate, they pooped, and they left, all right? And after they left, this is what the black nightshade plant looked like. There just really wasn't much there. It was a little depressing for this annual plant that gets 1 year to succeed or fail, right? But I kept coming back to the plot. I kept checking on the plant, and it started to regrow. The leaves came back, and eventually by the end of the year, it had fruits and made seed. So the story ended well for the plant and for this gang of insects, wherever they are now. But I think there were 9 of them. And I really still have no idea where they might have gone next, because I checked all the plants. I never saw them again. So there's this roving gang of blister beetles somewhere in the world. I found a mushroom one day, which is a species I get to count. I was excited about that, but this is what it looked like, and it was frustrating because I had been there the day before, right? So this is in the evening. I had been there the previous day. I didn't see any mushrooms. That's disappointing. And then 4 days later, I arrived in the morning, and I found another mushroom that looked the same. I said, great, now I get a picture of a live mushroom. I would have counted the other one anyway, but I counted this one. And I went home, and I was thinking, well, wait a second. If the other one was dried out by evening, I wonder how fast that happened. So I came back at noon, and it's already happening at noon. So that's a very short life cycle for this poor little mushroom. So if you ever wonder why you don't see more mushrooms, it might just be because you're not getting up early enough in the morning. Yeah, so that's what it looked like by noon. Speaking of fungus, here's a fly that also has a fungus on it. So this is a dead fly that I found in the plot one morning. It had crawled up on top of this little grass blade and died. And the reason it did that is that the fungus told it to. So you may have heard about this with other insects or other fungi, but in this case, what happens is a spore from that fungus lands on the fly. It puts a little hyphae, it grows its little stems down into the fly and then up through the fly and up into the brain while the fly is still alive. And it programs the brain of the fly and it says, crawl up high. And then it kills it. So this is a dead fly that has crawled up high because the fungus benefits from that, because as the fruiting bodies emerge again from the fly and they release the spores, it's up in the air where the breeze can catch it and the spores can be distributed. Also, what happens sometimes is Another fly of the same species but the opposite sex will come by to mate with this fly because it's just sitting there and it looks welcoming. And then it'll rub spores off on itself that way and carry those away and complete the cycle again that way. Flies. I met this fly for the first time. It's not new to science, it's new to me. Anybody know what it is? Eric? Nope. It's called a tiger fly. So Coenisia, Coenisia. Same for me. Turns out they're predators. So this one is, here's a tiger fly eating a little leaf hopper. Here's a tiger fly eating a little plant hopper. I would never have guessed that that was a predatory fly by looking at it. I did know this one was a predatory fly because I'd met it before. This is a long-legged fly. It's green, iridescent green, shiny-looking little fly, and it feeds on little ants and small creatures like that. That was in the plot. Here's a tree cricket. You guys all knew that, right? So you also probably know how to tell one tree cricket from another, right? Yeah. What you do is you look at the base of the antenna, and there's a little pattern there at the base of the antenna, and based on that pattern, you can tell whether it's one species or another or another or another, okay? The problem is, as a photographer, I don't usually get a picture like that, where you can see that part of the antenna. I'm pretty sure that all the tree crickets I photographed in my plot this year were the same species, but I don't know for sure because I don't have great pictures in the right place. But one day I showed up at the plot, and there was a tree cricket nearing the end of a process of molting and becoming a full adult. So they do this several times as they grow, right? They outgrow their exoskeleton, their skin. They got to get rid of the old skin and grow a new one. So it would just come out, and what I want you to focus on is the wings of this tree cricket. I'm going to show you several pictures in a row, taken over about an hour and a half time period, as those wings sort of started to dry out and expand and lengthen and get to the point where there was a full-sized tree cricket. So this is how I spend my life now. Sitting there for an hour and a half while I watch this. I did other things. I photographed other things within the plot over that hour and a half, but I really didn't leave the plot for that entire time. This is how obsessed I am. This is a little cobweb spider that hung out. It makes a little tent with silk and a leaf. This one had just caught a little sweat bee that it was feeding on. But a few days later, I saw either the same or a similar female in a different tent for a different purpose. And this time, the purpose was that there was a male hanging out, and it was mating time. And if you know anything about spiders and mating, this is a very dangerous thing for the male, right? Because the male needs to have interrelationships with the female and then needs to escape with its life. Because as soon as the important part is done, the male becomes food, okay? So it was really fun watching this spider approach very gently and carefully. And what it actually does, it actually puts the sperm into the hole of the spider, like with its little feelers. Like it directly inserts it and then like skedaddles, okay? And after it does that, it hangs out nearby and guards the female because it doesn't want anybody else's DNA to get mixed up with the DNA that it just worked very hard to share with that female. So I watched this entire process over a couple hours too, right? It was fascinating. And I laid on the ground on my belly with my camera like this, and my neck started to hurt, but it was all worth it. Okay, we talked about lynx spiders earlier. You guys all remembered that's a lynx spider, right? Okay, that's a lynx spider, like the cat, the lynx. Here's what the male looks like: shinier head, dark pedipalps. There are lots of lynx spiders. There's probably the most commonly seen spider that I had in the plot. And I got to watch them hunt. I got to watch them catch one of those long-legged flies I talked about, being a predator. I got to watch them catch wasps. They caught little bugs. And then, toward the end of the season, I got to watch them guard an egg sac. So this is a female lynx spider with an egg sac that she had filled with eggs, and she sat there on top of it for a week or so. And then when the eggs hatched and they all disappeared, she left, went somewhere else, but I got to photograph the little babies as they crawled around on the site and hung from little threads of silk and moved around. They were just amazing. Speaking of spiders, here's a crab spider. We had a different crab spider earlier I showed you. This is a big yellow crab spider sitting on butterfly milkweed. You remember the honeybees that we talked about earlier? There are lots of honeybees in the plot. And one day the two met. The crab spider enjoyed it more. The crab spider caught and ate this honeybee, but if you look closely, there's somebody else in the picture. So you see those little flies there. Those flies are called freeloader flies, also known as jackal flies. And what they do is they come and feed on the prey of other predators. which is great. And in this case, it's even better story because what happens here is so the question is, how do they know where they should be, right? And in this case, what happens is these honeybees release a chemical signal into the air when they get attacked to warn other honeybees that there's danger, right? Great for honeybees. Also really good for freeloader flies because they pick up on that signal and they track it down and they know that they can come feed on this free food that this crab spider has provided for them. That was amazing. That was a really good day. I knew that it happened, but I didn't know all the details of it, so I got to look it up after I got the pictures. All right, numbers. So far this year, this is hard to say. I went there 112 times this year between April 26th and last week. 94 different days out of 196. There were 14 times I went twice in the same day, and there were 2 days that I went 3 times. I'm not obsessed. I don't know why you think that. But I am a scientist, so I made a graph. So here's what it looks like graphically, if that helps anybody. So these are the days on the bottom. Each notch is a day, right? And you can see how many days. You can see the days I went twice and the days I went 3 times. It's a graph. Okay, how many species do you think I photographed in this year? A lot is a good answer. Yeah. 67 would be a really good number. Right now I'm at 319. I'm still getting things identified. I expect that to rise. But I'm happy with 319, especially because in 2018, when I thought this was a really cool project, I found 113, and I felt great about that. So I may triple that or come close to it, which is pretty exciting. So you might say, well, why so many more this year, right? One of the reasons, I think, is that they burned the prairie. And in 2018, they didn't burn the prairie first, which is fine either way. But when you burn the prairie, one of the things that happens is the soil is exposed, and I can see things running around on the soil that I couldn't see in 2018. So I got a lot of pictures of ants and leafhoppers and things early in the season that I probably would have missed the first time. But also, I think I'm better at it, right? I'm a better observer. I've done it before. I've spent a lot of time thinking about how to do it. I know that there's a lot of different kinds of flies, for example, or different kinds of beetles. And so if I see something that looks like what I've already photographed, I take a picture of it anyway because it might be different. So I've just gotten better. So here's the big list as it stands now. More flies than anything else, which is great. Here's a fun statistic for you. In North America, the most abundant, in terms of species, the most species-rich group of insects that we have in North America is flies. And that's because it includes midges and mosquitoes and lots of things that you might not think of as flies. Anybody want to guess how many species of flies we think there are in North America? We don't know because many of them have not been described. But how many do you think we have? A lot is another good answer. 12,000 is a really strong number. It's 5. 5 is a weaker number. Okay, we think there are 61,000 kinds of flies. I'm going to say that one more time. There are 61,000 kinds of flies in North America. How many species of flies can you name? Go. How many? Go. Housefly, that's one. Name another one. Horse flies don't count. There's lots of horse flies. Same with fruit flies. Dragonflies and butterflies don't count. Green bottle, that's 3. Tiger fly, very good. Smart, that's 4. Mosquito, but there's 200 different kinds of mosquitoes, so that doesn't. Freeloader flies, but there's a bunch of those too. So here's what I want to point out. There are 61,000 kinds of flies in North America, and this group of people who are interested in nature can name 4. Okay? We have some work to do as human beings getting to know our neighbors. Okay. Now, to finish up the project, or to finish up today, the project was really not a species inventory project, right? That's part of it. It's fun to see how many things I could photograph. But really, it was about enjoying the space. And so a lot of the time that I was spending was chasing light, trying to find different ways to photograph things. And sometimes I was literally chasing the light, as in the day that I looked out my window at home and we saw the brightest rainbow I've seen in many, many years. And I, of course, immediately said to my wife, I'm going. And I got in my truck, I drove across town, and I was jogging into the prairie with my camera bag on my back as the light was fading. I was like, oh, man. So I got an okay picture of a rainbow. But then afterwards, the Mammatus clouds came, and I got to enjoy, just playing with the light for a while with the Mammatus clouds too. So it was worth going over. But because it's a photography project, not a science project, I would do things like take a picture of a cucumber beetle feeding on pollen. That's a scientific photo. It's a nice scientific photo. But I would also take, sort of the modeling photos of the same insects. Or I would sit and play with the light as it changed over 10 minutes on one cucumber beetle in the morning as the sun rose and the light changed, and I just take a picture of that beetle as in different kinds of light. That's the kind of project this was, okay? Or I'd find a soldier beetle on a sunflower, but then I'd hang around and I'd take more artistic pictures of it as it moved around in the light, and different days I'd come back, and there was a lot of that happening. Same thing with flowers, right? Butterfly milkweed's a beautiful flower, even if there's 1 or 20 or 30 blossoms at the same time. And even after the blossoms fall off, they're really pretty. So I would take pictures of those too. And then of course, at the end of the season, they make seeds, and I'm a real sucker for milkweed seeds. So I photograph milkweed seeds. I'm showing you a tiny percentage of my milkweed seed photos. Tiny, tiny percentage of the milkweed seed photos that I have, because I just can't stop myself with milkweed seeds. Lead plant flowers are really pretty, but so are the leaves. So I spent a lot of time, if there wasn't anything else happening immediately, I'd go to the lead plant leaves and find interesting patterns, especially on dewy mornings when there's little droplets of water on those leaves. There's patterns within the patterns, it's great. So here's a photo of lead plant leaves in a pattern with a leaf hopper, and if you look closely, that little yellowish orange thing to the right of it is a little thrip, T-H-R-I-P, little insect that you see hanging around on flowers a lot of times. And then in the fall, lead plant turns colors like trees do because it's a woody plant. It's a wildflower, but it's kind of a shrubby wildflower. Grasses are amazing. I haven't talked a lot about grasses yet because I'm giving you a tiny piece of my presentation. I think I've got 150 or so photos today from the square meter plot. I have about 3,000 of them total. The other day I gave a show just on the square meter project. I had 450 slides. And even there, I felt bad because there's so many things that I'm leaving out. Anyway, grasses. This is Indian grass in flower. And if you haven't ever spent the time looking closely at grass flowers, Irely's done a lot of this, they're really beautiful, especially in front of a sunrise. Does anybody know what this plant is? No? Good guess. This is little blue stem. It's one of the most common grasses in Kansas, but you've never really looked closely at the flowers, have you? Especially on a dewy morning. They're beautiful. And the flowers of sunflowers, if you look closely, you can see easily there's lots of little flowers inside the big flower of a sunflower, right? So sunflowers are called a composite. There's a lot of these composites. Asters are all composites because there's lots of flowers sort of built into one. And even after they lose their petals, sunflowers are really fun to put against the light and silhouette in the mornings or evenings, or when the supermoon comes up and you say, I've got to go over to my plot because the supermoon's out tonight, I've got to photograph it. And I already talked about droplets of water, right? I'm a sucker for droplets of water too. How can you not be? They're beautiful. You can see the prairie through the droplet of water. You can have a droplet of water over the flower of a grass. And you can have a droplet of water on a spider to make the spider even more attractive than it was before. So I'm going to finish up by just kind of quickly browsing through a bunch of photos that I haven't already shown you because I couldn't leave everything out. But I'm also not going to talk a lot about them or we'll be here all day. But I just want to show you, sort of in an overwhelming maybe way, but hopefully pleasantly overwhelming way, how many things happen within one tiny little sliver of prairie, and hopefully encourage you to go out and find your own little spot to watch. Because you can do this in your backyard. You could do it in the crack in the sidewalk out front if you don't have anything better. There will be things to look at in one spot. And you can do it all in one day. You can do it through time. If you can do it through time, it's great because you can see things change. You get to see things grow up and get old and make seed or get attacked by gangs of blister beetles. There's lots of things that you can watch over time. But even if you just get a chance to go sit for a few minutes and look at something and see what comes and goes, the longer you sit there, the more you'll see because there'll be insects that were hiding until you looked long enough and then they make a move or you notice them in a way that you didn't before. Butterfly milkweed's great to put things in front of, by the way. Makes a great backdrop if you're looking for one. This is called a gall midge. If you were interested, this is a gall midge. There's a little green fly. There's a caterpillar. Big old longhorn beetle with milkweed behind it. Anybody know what this is? This is a moth fly. It's a fly. Drain fly, I think I saw Eric Mouth is also correct. There's lots of wasps in the project. Here's that tree cricket again. Got one slug. That was a fun morning. You know this one? This is a plant hopper. It's called a Durbid plant hopper. This is called a piglet plant hopper or piglet bug, I think. Here's a little ambush bug, a little predator. And this is the only thing I got from common milkweed, because common milkweed was in the plot but never flowered, but I got to have fun taking pictures of the leaves. Okay, so what am I going to do with all of this stuff? I don't know yet. One of the things that we did this time that's different is Platte Basin Time Lapse. There's a project in Nebraska. Mike Forsberg is a photographer you may or may not know. Mike put this group together with another Mike Farrell, and they put time-lapse cameras throughout Nebraska, parts of Wyoming, Colorado, throughout the big basin of the Platte River. But they also do all kinds of other video and art projects. So I contacted them at the beginning of the project. They came out and put up this time-lapse camera that took pictures every hour of the day through daylight hours. So you get to see me from the time-lapse camera taking pictures through the seasons, which is kind of neat. But in addition, they came out and we spent time together a couple times during the season looking at the plot together. They were taking pictures of the plot, taking pictures of me, doing a lot of video work, which I don't do a lot of video work, so it was really nice to have some video. So we're going to end up with some kind of video project out of this. I may or may not write a book about it. I don't know. I haven't decided yet. I'm just having so much fun with the project right now. But stay tuned. Something will happen. If nothing else, I'll write about it on the blog. I'll give talks like this. And more than anything else, I just want to encourage you that prairies are really neat. Even if there's no bison or prairie dogs, they're worth going out and spending time with. So thank you for your time.
So I'm sure Chris will answer some questions, and we also have, Therese kindly has a mic here, so I don't know if we'll need it, but why don't we pass it around?
Yeah, I'll let Therese decide who to answer questions, then we'll give her that power.
Oh, wow. Okay, let's start over here.
Two questions.
That's cheating, but go ahead.
Yeah, I know. Are you using focus stacking on some of these? And the other one is, so you're finding really small stuff. I find that I need to hold a lens myself, a big scanning lens, to be able to see what you're seeing. Are you using something like that?
Nope. Yeah, there you go. I answered both questions. No, I have a couple different macro lenses. I put them here because everybody always wants to know equipment. But I use a tripod for almost everything. And often what I'm doing with the tripod is I'm supporting the camera on 2 legs rather than 3 so that I can move the tripod back exactly. But I haven't done a lot of focus stacking, largely because I use all natural light. I don't use flash. I just don't enjoy using flash. And for me, photography, especially a project like this, is more about exploration. And so I don't spend the time doing a lot of that stuff because I've got 3,000 photos to get through. But it's a good question. Who's next? Here she's coming.
I'm coming.
What kind of egg did you photograph
What kind of egg?
on your list of?
Oh, I had an egg listed, yeah.
Had an egg.
I don't know. It's an insect egg or invertebrate egg of some kind. It looks like a butterfly egg. My best guess would be a butterfly or moth egg, but I can't find anybody who can identify it for me because it's hard enough to identify butterflies, harder to do caterpillars, and almost nobody can identify eggs. I'll probably never know. Yeah. No, a bird egg would have been even better, but no. Yeah. Microphone right behind you.
Thank you. What work has been done on the importance of the fungal communities to the prairies? Like the mushroom in that one photo made me think of that.
Man, there are several people in this room who should be answering that question instead of me. But there's been a lot. We still have a long way to go. Because it's underground, we know a lot less than we wish we did. But I just learned a bunch yesterday here talking to in the Beaver Schultz lab at KU. And several of the students and people that work there are here today, so they can maybe catch you later, and they're nodding. They'll come talk to you. You got them coming now. No, fungi are amazing, right? And so the fungi we were talking about yesterday are some of the ones that live in the soil that have very specific relationships with individual kinds of plants, and they make those plants much more competitive by forming these interrelationships with them. The mushrooms that I took a picture of there, that one probably I would guess, is probably going to be something that feeds on the roots of trees. I was close enough to trees, but there's others that just feed on the roots of other plants. The hyphae, the fungal networks under the soil are immense and comprehensive. So we know that they're really important, and we're still learning a lot about what they do.
Seems
like a great project, I'm sorry. Seems like a great project to do with a grandchild.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts about creating an interesting, diverse space in the backyard?
Yes, do it. That is my thought. It's, it's a lot easier now than it ever has been to find native plants and to get a diversity and put them together. And not only are you going to attract a lot of different kinds of insects and things, but you also get to watch how that plant community develops and establishes and changes over time. So if you have a chance to watch it over years, you get to learn who's stronger in what years, because and under what conditions, and just through time, there's cycles of things that you'll have. Something will do well one year and not the next. But no, I would encourage that, right? And again, like you can do it in the sidewalk crack, but your idea is better, and you'll see a lot more, obviously. But if you don't have a yard, any local park, if you have a little pot and put one flower in it, there'll be lots of things happening there too. It's really more about being willing to be patient and spend the time looking, and whatever you look at, you'll find. But yes, you should definitely put together a little diverse planting in your yard if you can. Okay, we'll hit you next.
Do you have any information about how the cowbird learns its song since it's raised by another species?
That is such a great question. I've wondered that my entire life. I have no idea. But let me clarify, because what he's asking is really good, right? So let's think about this. You're a cowbird. You hatch out from your egg in a meadowlark nest. So the only birds that you ever hang out with are meadowlark kids and meadowlark adults. The only song you hear is the meadowlark song from your parent right above you, who, as far as you know, is your parent. And then you grow up and mature and go off looking for, your adult pleasures. But you sing a cowbird song. When and how do you learn a cowbird song? And how do you know that you're a cowbird, if it comes right down to it, right? That's amazing. I don't know the answer to that, but it's a really fun thing to think about. Therese, we have a couple up front here, I think.
I think we'll take maybe two more. There's one here, maybe one
All right,
more.
let's do this one first.
Right here?
What made you want to do this project?
Well, first of all, I'm weird, in a good way. Now, I think the first time around, what made me want to do it was that I write a blog. I try to write something at least once a week, sometimes more. And I run out of things to say sometimes, or I feel like I'm saying the same thing. So I'm always looking for new ways to talk about the things that I want to share. And so the project was an interesting way to sort of refocus what I was talking about and do it in a different way. But also, the reason I did it the second time is it was a lot of fun the first time, and I kind of missed it. And it's interesting, as a photographer, I go to the same places pretty much every year, and in April, I know what I'm going to find, right? I mean, I always find different things to photograph, and it's great, but there is a little bit of a pattern that I get into, where here, I'm forcing myself to take a picture of what's in front of me. I don't get to wander around, and so I really have to study and look and explore in a very different way, and it's just a lot of fun. So thank you for that question. Okay, last one here, I think.
If you were going to work with, say, a small group of adolescents, what would you suggest as far as equipment goes? What would you need?
I've had a lot of fun with a hula hoop, and this is not my idea, other people do this too, but you can give a kid a hula hoop, you say close your eyes and throw the hula hoop, and assuming you're in a natural area and away from people that are gonna get hit, right? Go find your hula hoop, and you got 10 minutes to list everything you can find in that hula hoop. You don't have to have a name for it, but list all the different things that you see, right? I see 4 different grasses that look different from each other. There's 3 different things that are blooming. I found an ant, I found a little butterfly, I found an insect I don't know, but it's different. That's an easy way to do it and sort of fun for everybody. And then you can bring if you have multiple kids, you bring them all back, you have them talk about what they found, and they can work in pairs, they can do it alone, whatever. That's one way to go. Cameras? Cell phones can do some pretty amazing stuff. And I think that close-ups are hard with cameras, but they're not impossible. And you don't have to look for the really tiny stuff, right? So you could do that same project. And if they have a phone or they can borrow a phone, the great thing is it's easy then to share those photos back and forth when you get done too. And you can put them all on a wall or on a screen and talk about them. And You can take everybody's photos and go through and have everybody explain what they found and why they were excited about it. There's all kinds of things you can do that are great that way.
All right.
Okay.
Well, let's applaud, but what I want to mention is that now Chris is going to go back over with the Waving Bookstore. They're both the books there. They're fantastic. Again, I want to thank the library and KBS and Grassland Heritage, and do stop over at our GHF table. We'd love to see you out in the prairie.
Yeah. Thank you, everybody. This has been great.